This is a throwaway because only a handful of people closest to me know this happened. It's very difficult for me to talk about, but maybe it's time. Note, I'm 27 now, and this all happened when I was 18 and 19. I wasn't raised in a church. My parents grew up with very religious parents and didn't want to force anything on us. That being said, in high school, I got very curious about God, religion, all of that stuff. I started dating a guy when I was in 9th grade who took me to church with him. He was a Southern Baptist, so I kept going. We broke up, but this is all still important because that was my first experience with church. I just wanted to do the right thing. This isn't what this story is about, it's just a little background. Fast forward to senior year. I started dating another guy in my grade. He was always popular and pretty mysterious. Everyone knew he was religious but didn't know what kind. Everyone knew because his mom would attend our choir concerts always wearing long skirts, no jewelry or makeup, and had her hair in a bun. His best friend didn't even know what church he went to, but told me that they didn't have a TV and weren't allowed to watch movies. I was incredibly nervous to ask him what church he went to, even though we were dating and I figured after 3 months I should know. I had asked him a few times to go with me to the Baptist church, but he always declined. Finally, I got up the courage. I asked him what church he went to, and he only replied with, "You should see for yourself." I was excited. I get to be a part of it and part of his life. He invited me to his church. I went out and bought a long skirt and threw my hair up. I figured I should be respectful and dress like his mother. He picked me up that following Wednesday evening and drove me to the, quote, meeting. It was at a Holiday Inn conference room. Everyone there was very old except me, my boyfriend, his younger brother, and 2 toddlers. The meeting, that's what they called it anyway, was run by 2 very elderly women from Ireland. Well, I'm pretty sure it was Ireland. I could barely understand them, but the Bibles they used were normal Bibles, so I didn't feel too uncomfortable. They had a hymnal that just said hymns on the front. Everyone sang a cappella, there were never instruments, and it was a very strange evening. But because they used a typical Bible, I figured it was fine. I eventually stopped attending the Baptist church I was a part of and went strictly to my boyfriend's meetings. Wednesdays were held at the Holiday Inn, and Sundays were held in various friends' houses. Every member was called a, quote, friend. The meetings weren't huge, maybe 10 to 20 people. Each fall and spring, though, they held, quote, conventions. They would be on someone's farm and include every friend in the state, and sometimes a few surrounding states. Those were very, very big. We would stay in quarters and listen to people speak from the Bible. You also had a chance to stand up and read a verse that meant something to you. This all happened very slowly and over the course of 2 years or so. I must have been obsessed with just trying to do the right thing and follow Jesus, because I didn't notice that I was being brainwashed. He took my virginity. I ended up living with them. I had no idea to this day how that transition even happened, or if my parents wondered where I was. My parents were in the middle of a messy divorce and honestly probably didn't notice that I was gone. My boyfriend's mom didn't believe in using hospitals or doctors and took a holistic approach to her family's and my health. She had me on different vitamins every day of the week. I was already very skinny, but over time lost even more weight. I probably got down to 80 or 90 pounds. She also gave me iodine drops under my tongue every day. This all led to me being severely underweight, and I had to stop sleeping almost completely. I think the doctors ended up saying it was all the vitamin B12 in my system. While in my hazy state of mind, I ended up getting baptized in a lake at one of the conventions. Shortly thereafter, when we went home, I started having panic attacks. Everything from this time is such a blur to me. Such a blur. I eventually had one big panic attack that threw me over the edge. I had a complete mental breakdown. I remember a few things very vividly. I tried to read the Bible to calm down and couldn't read anymore. Everything was just shapes and blobs. This led to more crying. My dad remarried 2 weeks after the divorce and married a woman named Nikki. I was convinced that they were both Satan because of this. I tried to jump off a very high hill near the house I was staying at. I would have at the very least broken many bones if not died. I thought I was already dead and was convinced their house was a coffin, and they were burying me outside and my soul was overhearing it all. I guess they realized that something was wrong and probably didn't want to be liable because they found my dad's number and told him to come get me. I actually fought going and cried and screamed, but my dad took me back to his house. I didn't sleep that night again and thought his house was the Twin Towers and that I was stuck inside as they were falling down. I started seeing small rainbows everywhere too. My brain was completely fucked, you guys. The next day, my dad and stepmom took me to a behavioral health hospital. I remember that it was the day that Steve Irwin died because my dad told me in the waiting room, and I thought for sure that he murdered Steve Irwin, and that's how he knew that he was dead. But it was just on the news in the waiting room. Either way, I stayed in an acute wing of the hospital for 2 weeks. They took my vitals several times a day and night, and I had to go to group therapy sessions and drink Ensure all day until I was finally up to a healthy weight. That man and his family fucked me up. I hope I never see them again. It's almost 10 years later and I have nightmares about them still. I had one last night actually. They're mostly just present in my dream. I had the courage to finally try and Google the name of their cult. It took some digging, but they're called 2 by 2s. Sorry this was so long. So much happened to me. This is just all I can remember. I joined a very extreme charismatic church in and around 2006 when I was 16 years old. I'm female. I was very involved and would attend church around 5 times per week. The movement started in the UK, but I'm from Canada. When I was 18 years old in 2008, I took a gap year after high school to go and volunteer in one of the churches in the UK. The rules were fairly strict. Women were not allowed to preach, and it was taught that men were the head of the household. Things got even more intense from there. The elders would not let me leave prayer until I, quote, encountered the Holy Spirit, aka falling on the floor or acting like I did. I was made to sign a contract that said I would work 60 hours a week for 12 months. However, before signing the contract, I reminded them that I would be leaving in June because I was starting university that fall and wanted to have the summer at home. In April, they told me that I was not allowed to leave until September when my visa was up. The elders told me that they had a meeting without me, and that God had told them that I had to stay for the rest of the year. Being an 18-year-old girl, I was naive and terrified. I told my parents. My parents threatened to go to the media, as I was being held against my will in another country. The elders from my church back in Canada basically had a lot of bad press already, so they convinced the elders in England to let me go. Since then, I've become an atheist, but not without being kicked out of the church first, because I smoked pot. If I ever asked questions, they would tell me I had a deceiving spirit and try to pray it out of me. They only let me read the books that they said I could. Their organization was also very pro-Jews and spread hate about Islam. I was into drugs and trouble when I was a teenager, and as a last-ditch effort, my parents shipped me off to a fundamentalist Christian treatment center a couple of states away when I was 17. While I did end up actually turning my life around as a result of the whole thing, it sort of ended up being an out-of-the-frying-pan and into-the-fire experience, in that once I've completed the program, which was over a year long, I ended up moving in with a guy who worked there and becoming involved in the church youth group. Unbeknownst to me, of course, was a cult in its initial embryonic stages. It's a long story, but the guy I moved in with was renting from this guy who was a very heavy metal drummer who'd gotten, quote, saved and become something of a self-proclaimed prophet with the local charismatic Christian scene. He acquired the inevitable cult following that comes along with something like that. I got sucked into his social circle because I was young, insecure, and naive. Also because I had just gotten done spending 15 months steeped in a culture of biblical literalism and charismatic fervor after a few years doing as many drugs as I could get my hands on. Take note, drugs tend to have a detrimental effect on the developing mind. One of the girls in the youth group that hung around our place got her school to invite this guy to do an assembly program. He brought some musician friends of his, played a show, and afterwards talked to the auditorium full of students about his experiences growing up poor and getting sucked into the sex, drugs, and rock and roll scene. Afterwards, the school invited him to come back and do the same thing the following year. Long story short, this guy was already kind of a megalomaniac and an ego-driven asshole. And being on stage in front of all those kids turned into his new favorite drug. It's hard to explain the process by which I and all of my friends at the time were sort of mentally seduced into devoting our entire lives to helping to build this guy's empire. But within a year, we were all raising money by doing car washes, grocery baggings, and soon manning tables of merch, and just straight up soliciting donations to funnel straight into this guy's pockets. Ostensibly, it was all going to fund these high school programs, that we as his followers were responsible for booking as many as possible, because the programs were to be free to the schools, but he was actually charging the schools for the productions under the table. This is actually really hard to talk about. At the same time, there was a heavy Christian aspect to the whole thing. This guy thought he had a direct connection to God himself, and there were consistently these spontaneous meetings that he would have all of us come to his house, where he would just talk and talk for hours about what God was doing and how we were all called to be a part of it. I mean, it was some very fucked up stuff, and I bought it all, hook, line, and sinker, even though I never felt right. I allowed myself to be convinced that my reservations were my flesh and the devil, and that the very voice of reason itself was a temptation that God was calling me away from. This went on for a while. The first time I had a falling out with this guy was while he was cutting me a check for work that I had done for him. He spontaneously and irrationally attacked me out of the clear blue sky, shoving me up against a wall and swearing a blue streak at my face, all while threatening over and over to break my nose off. I talked him down, walked away, and didn't come back for a year. I was sick in the head though, and I eventually decided that I needed to, quote, come back to the Lord, and of course, the way to do this was to track this guy and his team of minions down and give them hundreds of dollars. Suddenly, we were best friends again. The culture of fraud and manipulation had gotten even deeper and weirder since I had been away. There was now quite a bit of money being raised, not just by soliciting donors at public events, but through high-level investors as well, and everybody was doing the fundraising thing full-time and just stockpiling guns. The leader and his wife would routinely disappear for weeks at a time, and I came to find out that what they were doing was going to Florida and Hawaii a lot, because, dangling that carrot is a lot of work. What I'm describing is a really pretty incomplete picture of the whole thing, because I'm really rushing through the story. Shortly after coming back to the group, I realized that I couldn't stand to live like that anymore, and I moved away, back to the state where I grew up, and started my own youth outreach program. But literally the day I moved away, this guy called me and started working on me to get me to come back into the fold. After 7 months, I folded. No pun intended, sorry, that was terrible. And came back when he offered me some ridiculous amount of money to run the church that he'd started while him and his ministry team were on the road. Again, to abbreviate things, I'll just say that when I moved back, I found myself in circumstances severely different from what he had described, and the money, to put it bluntly, never happened. He had just swindled me again. Thoroughly disillusioned, I left again, this time for good, and never went back. After about a year, I relapsed under the mental, whatever the hell you would call what happens to your mind after 5 years of what I just described, and spent the better part of a decade just working at a coffee shop and getting as drunk and stoned as I could afford to every night. Something I didn't bring up though was that when I first got out of treatment as a teenager and got involved with that youth group, I'd started seeing a girl, and after a year we got married. She'd been with me the whole time through this experience, and after leaving that group for good and spending years and years drunk off my ass, she finally convinced me to get some help, which I did. I went into treatment again and cleaned up, and then went to college and earned an AAS, and I actually just got my first job in the field this week. So, this story does have some sort of happy ending. Well, the best part of it is that within the last couple of years, literally every one of my friends from back in the day that were involved with this guy finally walked out on him and blew the whistle on the whole fraud thing. So it looks like he's probably up the creek. A local news media outlet has been following the story for the last couple of years now, but I don't think I'm supposed to post a link or any of that, since it would reveal personal information and stuff. But yeah, the whole thing was just a huge fucking nightmare. When I was in my early teens, my parents had this, quote, midlife crisis. They were always religious, but they encountered this group that took the whole thing to another level. Certain facets of their faith were somewhat neglected, and their marriage wasn't very stable at this time, so they grasped onto this and took us along for the ride. It all started out with a summer camp. Something innocent sounding enough, right? There were about 35 other boys going to it from all over the country. I would later realize this summer camp wasn't really about swimming, playing games and sports, going on day trips to places like Niagara Falls or Washington, D.C. It was the first stage of the recruitment to join. Most of the children there were from large families that were intimately familiar with the group. A lot of their older or younger brothers were attending the camp. Most of them had gone for years because the purpose of the program was to draw in boys to their boarding school. In fact, the camp took place at the boarding school campus. After the summer program was over, my brother wanted to go there for high school instead of the local public school. I had really no desire to go to public school after the absolutely horrible 8th grade year I had in middle school next door, so that, coupled with the pressure of my parents and my brother, had me going to the boarding school that September. Things started off decently. There wasn't much pressure, but it was a very religious school. Prayers several times a day, there was the option to go to church every morning, and instruction was completely from their unique Catholic perspective in every way. I would attend the school for 3 years, 2 on, 1 off, and my graduate year. This school really just served as their second stage of the organizational recruitment. Not everyone who attended joined or was expected to join, but those who showed enough fervor or interest were groomed to becoming full-time members. When I was 16, I knew full well I wasn't going to ever join this group, but my brother did. I'm not sure if he's gay or just never had much luck with girls, but he decided to forego all of that for, quote, the cause, and joined right after he completed high school. For the most part, I never really realized just how far out this organization was until years later when I had a crisis in my own religious faith and became a non-believer. I saw just how they treated the many people who left the group over time. Most, if not all, who leave the group don't lose their faith, but there is a lot of ostracizing. While in the school, we did a lot of things with the rest of the group, including protesting campaigns for things we didn't fully understand, plus attending some of their Saturday meetings at their headquarters, events, conferences, marches, etc. Their methods were not extreme, but they fostered a severe, quote, us versus the world mentality. Rock music was satanic. Anyone who didn't embrace our version of belief and morals was a monster/horrible person. Everything was seen in black and white, and they couldn't comprehend how somebody could disagree on one thing with them, yet agree on many other things. At their meetings, they did a lot of patting themselves on the back by talking about their campaigns and their supposed success of them, how they were going to bring the world back to, quote, order, which according to them meant their version of Catholicism. Most of them didn't even like the Pope at the time, because he wasn't fire and brimstone enough. Speaking of that, a lesser talked about subject publicly, but strongly believed and discussed privately, was that the world was going to enter this period of death, destruction, and, quote, end times that would last many, many years. Even they prepared for it in some ways by building a sort of bomb shelter in one of the buildings. This would then be followed by 1,000 years of, quote, reign of Mary, in which they would lead the world back to religion, and it would be happy times and glory to be had for all. My brother even bought into this stuff a lot when he was younger, mocking me for my interest in technology because, quote, it isn't going to do you any good when the nukes fall and there's no electricity. That was probably just a harmless tease on his part, but it always irritated me that he actually thought living like a hermit was the best, most productive use of our lives, or that foregoing technology was wise because you might have to live without it at some point. As it is, my parents still like the group. I see my brother once, maybe twice a year, and I don't really communicate with anyone there anymore. For years though, my brother didn't even want to visit us. He was always terrible about planning anything, and acted like we weren't important. It did bother my parents that he had separated himself from us to such an extent, but now that they're more religious than ever, they see it as a good thing he's doing there. Throwaway. I was born and raised in a cult, and considered myself a member up until I left my parents' home at the age of 18. The group that I associated with is not well known, but the effects of the members are tragic and undeniable. We were literally brainwashed. We had weekly services with a set program, 3 hymns, prayer, sermonette, hymn, announcements, main message, hymn, prayer. It never altered from that layout. As well, the messages we would hear were often videotaped sermons from maybe 5 main people at, quote, headquarters. The topics were extremely narrow. Prophecy, the end is coming. Self-improvement, all of you suck and you should hate yourself. Setting ourselves apart. Don't talk to, quote, worldly people, they will taint you. There were many ways in which we were indirectly encouraged to harm ourselves. Many people looked down upon modern medicine and felt that using it was a way of turning away from God, slapping him in the face, so to speak, and making it clear that he wasn't needed. I personally knew people who died for their faith, waiting for God to heal them. On the other hand, when any of the main leaders fell ill, they were immediately rushed off to receive medical care. They controlled our diet. We pretty much were kosher, though they denied all influence or association with or from Jews. There were annual days of fasting, and whenever the leadership could scare up enough drama within the members, they would declare a, quote, church-wide fast, so we could all gather closer to God and resolve our issues. We fasted when the church's income was said to be dropping. We fasted when the leaders were ill. We fasted when people died. We had our own personal fasts for the hell of it, or when we felt especially guilty and out of touch with God. Parents were encouraged to get their children involved as young as possible. My parents tell me I started observing the annual fast when I was only 3 years old. I remember one year when my brother was 2 or 3, at one point during the day, he just broke down sobbing because he was so thirsty. Oh yeah, we abstained from food and drink. We got obscenely dehydrated every time. Looking back, I just don't understand how a parent can behave that way. They were so sex negative, I can't even describe. We spent so much time and energy frantically thinking, I can't think about sex. And that was all we thought about. It was evil, dirty, and wrong, and it would hurt if we weren't married. I literally built up so much fear over it that when I finally did decide to have sex, as an unmarried adult, I had developed vaginismus, a sexual pain condition. The cause is often psychological, in my case being so afraid of it hurting that it actually did hurt, which further fed into my fear. There was actually an entire message once where one of the leaders took on the subject, "Are we a cult?" And he actually went through a checklist for us. His conclusion was that we were a cult, but it was actually a good thing. We should be proud, only not. Pride is a sin. We should be pleased. You had to be baptized before a minister would marry you. You couldn't be baptized and marry someone else who wasn't. You couldn't marry outside the church, and some ministers wouldn't baptize you if they thought your only incentive was to get married. There were rampant cases of sexual abuse from the leadership, but we were always too fearful to report it. We were always taught that it must have, in some way, been our fault. Quote, traditional gender roles were enforced, i.e. women stay home, pop out babies, cook, and clean. Men were to work and support the home. Having children, and lots of them, was strongly encouraged. Quote, be fruitful and multiply, and all that shit. Adoption was frowned upon, even for those who were unable to have their own children. So many families were living in poverty because there were just too many children to take care of. God forbid that any of them have a medical condition that required constant treatment. We were robbed on a regular basis. Not only did we give 10% of our entire income, but we were also to set a second 10% aside to be used at a 7-day religious convention of sorts every year. And on every 3rd year, we would give an additional 10% to the church. Imagine losing 20% of your income every year and 30% every 3rd year. Imagine being poor to begin with. Imagine being told you're poor because you have been literally stealing from God by not diligently paying your fees. I could go on forever. There's so much. I was raised in a cult. Both of my parents were members of the Children of God, nowadays called the Family International. We traveled all over Europe from city to city and performed music on the streets and passed out leaflets to convert people. I have many brothers and sisters, mostly from different dads, as the philosophy of the sect was kind of rooted in the free love hippie movement. There are some pretty serious and I think conclusive accusations of child sexual abuse within the sect, but thankfully my parents didn't do that. My stepdad, however, physically and verbally abused us, as corporal punishment was very encouraged. He never got caught, although we frequently showed overt signs of abuse, but since we weren't ever in one place more than a couple of days, well, we were of course all homeschooled too, which I hated, since that was also a constant source of abuse. My stepdad taught me timetables by asking me repeatedly, "What's X times Y?" And if I get the result wrong, I'd get slapped on the fingers with a cooking spoon as many times as the result was. Thankfully, my parents got out of the sect by the time I was about 13 years old. My stepdad didn't give up his habits though, which continued until I was big enough to fight back. Settling into regular school was difficult, as I was consistently and heavily bullied for wearing secondhand clothes, not speaking German well, and just being completely different. After a couple of years though, I went from worst in the class to best and being kind of accepted. Nowadays, I still have some lingering issues, which I'm not sure if they'll ever be fixable. One of them is trust issues, which has also prevented me so far from seeking any therapy. It was all a very long time ago too, and I've pretty much made my peace with it all already. I think my parents got out of the sect before it got really crazy. Exchange students sometimes have it worse. I was an exchange student from Malaysia and was placed in Missouri in 2006. They were a family of 4, with a son and a daughter, and they lived somewhere around Webster Groves. They looked nice, warm and welcoming, but it was all a facade, for they were trying to gain my trust. Coming from a country where all of your neighbors are practicing a million different religions would kind of desensitize you, or make you very aware. I was the latter. The first week was fine, but sometimes I would wake up a little early and find them gathered in the kitchen in a circle, around the kitchen table, mumbling and whispering. They'd stop as soon as I entered. It was very disconcerting, but I brushed it off thinking it was just an American quirk. During the second and third week, it became worse. The boy wouldn't touch me because, quote, "I'm born from sin," his words, and the girl was afraid of me because I spoke to the father whilst looking him in the eye. I started prodding her for answers whenever little things that I did, which are normal by the way, like reading before bed, talking directly to the parents, eating a sandwich, would elicit small gasps and hyperventilation from her. She told me that I have residues of the wicked and that I'm going to hell. She told me about a, quote, "cleanse," and a daily prayer wash. I've seen them singing the same hymns over and over again, reciting the same verses in different tones, and it really freaked me out. I wasn't stupid. I realized I was in a cult when they took me to, quote, "church." I was made to sit in the front, and the pastor was conducting the service specifically for me. I realized it when I looked around and saw that everyone was looking at me. I felt like I was in a horror movie. Wide-eyed, silent stares. Men and women were separated. People wore different colored ribbons on their wrists, and the children looked haunted or just plain frightened. Nobody spoke to me or even came close to me. The men never looked me in the eye, and the women whispered and shunned me. I went there twice. School was on break, so I had to stay in with them. Many weird things happened, but none was as bad as waking up in the middle of the night to find the mother sitting next to my bed, reciting verses from the Bible in the dark. As soon as I'm awake, she'd stop and silently walk away. The family began treating me badly after that. I was punished for being out of line, meaning no dinner, locked in till morning, no sweet drinks. I had to cover up with long-sleeved tops, long pants and a skirt, etc. I think I lasted because I was curious. They probably thought that since I'm from Southeast Asia, I must be quite gullible and naive. They tried brainwashing me about how sinful I was, how, quote, lost I was, how the world is going to end and I'll be dragged into hell unless I accept their teachings. I was there for a month before our chapter coordinator came by for a visit. I told her everything, outside the house naturally, and left with her immediately. We came back with a group of people from the exchange organizations about an hour later and found them in the midst of burning the things of the, quote, sinful non-believer. Thankfully, my passport and other relevant docs were untouched. I never found out what kind of cult they were. I was born and raised in a cult as well, left the week before I turned 18. I don't particularly want to name it, as though it's not well known, it can definitely be Googled, and I've been hiding this part of my life too long to be able to open up about it now. A lot of what I've read on this post, or in the replies, sounds familiar. Praying, fasting, guilt, prophecy, end times, guilt, isolation, communal living, guilt, tithing, self-loathing, guilt. A big difference between the OP's experience and the one that I was raised in is that sex was highly encouraged, and that's putting it mildly. Enforced is not the right word, but it's the first one that comes to mind. In my opinion, second-generation cult kids have it the absolute worst. We didn't ask for it. We literally didn't know any better. That was our quote normal. By the time second-generation kids come around, the cult is still new enough that later generations haven't been able to mellow it out yet, and small enough that horrible practices and abuse are able to pass under the radar. Abuse was so much a part of my life. Physical, sexual, mental, you name it, that when I left and started socializing with regular folks, I couldn't begin to process what real socializing was, let alone dating or an active sex life. I couldn't understand, couldn't believe it, and I couldn't accept it. I've been locked in rooms for 3 days and nights to, quote, fast and pray. I've been denied contact with other humans for weeks, or even months, to, quote, get closer to God. I was given to men by request. I was once held down by 4 men, while a group of maybe a dozen other men exorcised me. They believed I was possessed by a demon because of my inability to be like them, to, quote, get with the program. I was spanked, beaten, and whipped most of my life. Simply put, I was terrified my entire childhood. I lived every second of my life in fear. Anyway, all of this to say, I absolutely understand you, and I feel for you, OP, and anyone else who has suffered from this. And I wish I had better advice on how to recover, move on, and be free of it. Just remember that you are free of it. They have no power over you anymore. Always remember that. And enjoy every damn breath of air. You get twice as much as you should, simply because it's a free breath. Good luck. And in case you were wondering, no, I'm absolutely not religious in any way, shape, or form. I believe religion is a cancer. No offense is intended.